June 6, 1944. 1:14 in the morning. Somewhere over the Cotentin Peninsula, in northern France, a Douglas C-47 Skytrain transport aircraft shudders through a wall of anti-aircraft fire. The fuselage rings with the sound of shrapnel striking aluminum, a sharp metallic pinging that sounds like someone throwing handfuls of gravel at a tin roof. The pilot, a 24-year-old captain from Columbus, Ohio, who has never flown through flak before tonight, fights the yoke as tracers arc past the cockpit windows in long chains of green and orange light. He banks hard. The aircraft tilts. 20 men standing in the fuselage grab each other for balance. Inside the cabin, the air is thick enough to taste. Aviation fuel, hydraulic fluid, vomit from the replacement who lost his nerve somewhere over the channel. Sweat from 20 bodies packed into a space designed for cargo, not men. The smell of fear, which is not a metaphor, but a real thing. The sour chemical odor of adrenaline leaking through skin. 20 paratroopers from the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division, stand hooked to the static line that runs the length of the cabin ceiling. They cannot sit. The equipment makes sitting impossible. Each man carries nearly 40 kilograms of gear strapped and clipped and taped to his body in a configuration that makes him look less like a soldier and more like a human bomb of canvas and steel. The red jump light by the door glows steady. Not yet. Stand by. One man is calm. His name is Corporal Frank Kowalski, 22 years old, Polish-American from the south side of Chicago. The kind of neighborhood where every father worked the mills or the stockyards, and every son learned before he could shave that the difference between a good tool and a bad tool was not about how much it cost or how impressive it looked. A good tool worked when you needed it. A bad tool broke. That was all there was to know. That was everything worth knowing. While the replacements grip their harness straps with white knuckles and move their lips in prayers, they half remember from childhood Kowalski's hands are steady. Not because he is braver than the men beside him. Courage is not the absence of fear. Every man on this aircraft is afraid, and anyone who says otherwise has never stepped out of a perfectly good airplane into darkness at 600 feet above enemy territory. Kowalski is calm because he knows something the replacements do not. Tucked behind his reserve parachute flat against his chest, held in place by the webbing straps of his T5 harness, is a weapon that weighs 5.2 pounds and measures 25 inches with its stock folded against the left side of the receiver. An M1A1 carbine. He knows this weapon will be in his hands loaded and ready to fire within 3 seconds of his boots hitting French soil. 3 seconds. Not 40. 3. The man who should be standing beside him tonight is not here. Private Tommy Novak, Slovak-American from the same South Side neighborhood. Same parish at Immaculate Conception. Same stickball games on Mackinac Avenue. Tommy's father worked at Republic Steel 2 blocks from the Kowalski apartment. Tommy enlisted the same week Frank did. They went through jump school together. They were assigned to the same platoon in the 505th. Tommy carried an M1 Garand in a Griswold bag when they jumped into Sicily 11 months ago. His bag separated from the harness during the opening shock. Tommy landed with no primary weapon. A German patrol found him before he could find the bag. Frank heard the shots from 2 fields away. He ran toward his friend with the weapon that worked. He was too late. Frank Kowalski carries 2 things into this jump over Normandy. His M1A1 carbine, the weapon Tommy Novak should have had. And the memory of those shots in a Sicilian wheat field that he will hear every night for the rest of his life. The green light comes on. The jump master slaps the first man on the shoulder. The line surges forward. 20 men shuffle toward the open door, where the Norman night howls past at 120 miles per hour. Frank steps to the threshold. Below him there is nothing but darkness and tracer fire and the fate of the free world. He jumps for Tommy. He jumps with the weapon Tommy should have had. 2 years and 3 months before this moment, the weapon did not exist. The problem it was designed to solve was killing American paratroopers at a rate that no enemy could match. And the solution came from a place so unlikely that the men who proposed it were not even gunsmiths. This is that story. March 1942. Fort Benning, Georgia. The United States Army is building airborne divisions faster than it can figure out how to arm them. The 82nd Infantry Division is being reorganized into the 82nd Airborne Division under Major General Matthew B. Ridgway, a lean, hard-driving officer who pins a live grenade to his harness every time he visits the front lines. so he will never be taken alive. The 101st Airborne Division is forming simultaneously. Both divisions need thousands of paratroopers trained and equipped and ready for combat operations within months because the war is not waiting for anyone. The United States has been at war for 3 months. The news from every front is catastrophic. The Japanese have conquered the Philippines. Malaya has fallen. Singapore has fallen. Burma is falling. The Dutch East Indies are gone. In North Africa, Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps is pushing the British back toward Egypt and the Suez Canal. On the Eastern Front, the German Wehrmacht is preparing a summer offensive that will drive toward Stalingrad and the oil fields of the Caucasus. The map of the world in March 1942 is a map of Axis victories, and every week the United States spends solving problems at home is a week the enemy uses to dig deeper into conquered territory. America needs airborne forces. The question is not whether paratroopers will jump into combat. The question is whether they will be armed when they land. Sergeant Eddie Sullivan watches another training jump from the edge of Drop Zone C and adds another failure to the mental catalog he has been building for 6 months. Sullivan is 34 years old. Irish-American from South Boston, the kind of neighborhood that produced more Medal of Honor winners per square mile than almost anywhere else in the country, and more bar fights per Saturday night than the military police wanted to count. He enlisted in the regular army in 1928 at 20, when his father's drinking finally cost the family the apartment on L Street, and Eddie decided that 3 meals a day and a clean bunk were worth the price of taking orders from men he was smarter than. 14 years of service. Panama, where the humidity rusted a rifle overnight. The Philippines, where the heat could drop a man at noon. Fort Huachuca, Arizona, where the desert sand got into everything mechanical and destroyed it. Camp Beauregard, Louisiana in summer, where the mosquitoes were so thick a man could choke on them at dusk. Sullivan has forgotten more about weapons handling under stress than most officers will ever learn. His hands are mapped with scars from 14 years of field stripping every weapon the United States Army issues in every climate the planet offers. His voice carries across a parade ground without strain, a natural instrument that does not need volume to command attention. He has a gift that cannot be taught and cannot be faked. The ability to look at a system under stress and identify the exact point where it will fail. He is watching the Griswold bag system fail. The Griswold bag is a heavy canvas sack designed to protect the M1 Garand rifle during a parachute jump. The procedure, as described in the training manual and practiced in hundreds of rehearsals, is straightforward. Disassemble the Garand into 3 components before boarding the aircraft. Barrel, receiver. Stock. Pad the pieces with cotton waste inside the canvas bag to prevent metal striking metal. Clip the bag to the parachute harness. Board the C-47. Exit the door at 120 miles per hour. Survive the opening shock when 28 feet of silk deploys overhead and the harness straps dig into the shoulders and groin with a force that can crack ribs if the fit is wrong. Float down. Land at 20 feet per second, which is the equivalent of jumping off a 12-foot wall while carrying the weight of a grown man in equipment on your back. Roll to absorb the impact. Stand up. Open the bag. Remove 3 disassembled pieces of the M1 Garand. Thread the barrel into the receiver. Make absolutely certain the threads engage cleanly. A cross-threaded barrel means the weapon cannot fire. Lock the action. Insert the 8-round en-bloc clip. Feel for the retaining notch if you are doing this in the dark, which you will be, because airborne operations are conducted at night. Chamber around. Now fight. The United States Army Ordnance Department, in its engineering specifications, estimates this procedure can be completed in 40 seconds by a trained soldier under controlled conditions. Sullivan watches a 19-year-old private from Iowa try it on a sunny Georgia afternoon with no one shooting at him, and his hands dry and warm and steady. The kid takes 1 minute and 12 seconds. The barrel cross threads on the first attempt. He drops the clip in the grass. His second attempt takes 51 seconds. His third takes 44. Sullivan has a line that he delivers to every training class. It is not a slogan or a motivational phrase. It is a professional assessment born from 14 years of watching men die because of equipment that worked in a laboratory and failed in a foxhole. The weapon that kills you, Sullivan says, is the one that doesn't work when you need it. He watches the kid from Iowa fumble with the Griswold bag one more time and turns away. He has seen enough. He writes his observations in the field report he submits every week. The Griswold bag system has a theoretical reassembly time of 40 seconds. Observed times under training conditions, average 60 to 90 seconds. Under simulated combat stress, observed times exceed 2 minutes. Under actual combat conditions with darkness, cold hands, incoming fire, and the physiological effects of extreme fear, the system will fail for a significant percentage of paratroopers. Sullivan does not write what he is thinking. What he is thinking is simpler and more brutal than a field report allows. 40 seconds is a death sentence. The Germans need 10. The EM-1 Garand is the finest infantry rifle in the world in 1942, and there is no serious argument to the contrary. General George S. Patton calls it the greatest battle implement ever devised. 9.5 pounds of American steel and walnut, 43.6 inches long. Chambered in .3006 Springfield, a cartridge that has served America faithfully since 1906. Firing a 150-grain bullet at 2,800 feet per second, with enough energy to kill a man reliably at 500 yards and wound him grievously at twice that distance. Semi-automatic gas-operated, feeding from an 8-round en-bloc clip that loads from the top with a clean metallic snap and ejects when the last round fires with the famous metallic ping that every man who served in the Second World War recognizes the way he recognizes his own name. For regular infantry, for men who walk to the battlefield and dig in and fight from fixed positions, the Garand is magnificent. It gives the individual American rifleman a rate of accurate fire that no bolt-action rifle in any other army can match. For paratroopers, the Garand is a catastrophe. Sullivan catalogs the failure modes with the precision of an engineer and the anger of a soldier who knows that each failure he observes on a training field in Georgia will kill someone on a battlefield he cannot yet name. The slung Garand in its Griswold bag catches on brush during movement to the drop zone. The 43.6-inch length hits the backs of helmets, slides off shoulders, makes it impossible to wear the standard field pack properly, forcing every paratrooper to choose between carrying his pack correctly and carrying his weapon securely. Men who jump with Garands clipped to their harnesses experience the weight shifting during the violent exit from the C-47 door. The 9.5 pounds of rifle pulls the harness off balance. Men tumble instead of making clean exits. Twisted risers. Parachute malfunctions. Men injured before they reach the ground. On the ground, the failures multiply. Fingers numbed by the cold air at jump altitude where temperatures can be 30 or 40 degrees below the ground. Temperature struggle with the threaded barrel connection that requires fine motor control to engage properly. Sand from the landing zone gets into the open receiver before the weapon is even assembled. One man in a training exercise breaks his wrist when his Griswold bag catches a tree branch during descent and wrenches his arm at an unnatural angle. Another lands on his bag and bends the barrel just enough to throw off the rifle's zero, but not enough to notice until his first shot misses by 2 feet at 50 yards. And the worst case, the case that makes Sullivan's jaw clench every time he sees it happen. The Griswold bag tears loose from the harness during the exit or the opening shock. The heavy canvas sack with its disassembled rifle falls away into the darkness and vanishes. A paratrooper whose bag separates during the jump lands behind enemy lines with no primary weapon. He has a pistol maybe, a knife, grenades he cannot throw accurately past 20 yards. He has a full combat load of ammunition for a rifle that is lying in a field somewhere he will never find. He is a dead man who has not been told yet. Across the Atlantic, the Germans have already demonstrated what happens when airborne forces carry the right weapons. Fort Eben Emael, Belgium, May 10, 1940. 78 German glider troops from the Coke Assault Detachment landed silently on the roof of the most powerful fortress in Western Europe. The fort was built into a cliff face overlooking the Albert Canal. Its guns controlled 3 critical bridges. Over 1,200 Belgian soldiers defended it. The Germans were outnumbered more than 15 to 1. The gliders carried no engines. They made no sound. They skidded across the fortress roof in the gray Belgian dawn, and 78 men climbed out carrying shaped charges and MP-40 submachine guns that were ready to fire the instant their boots hit concrete. Within 10 minutes, the main guns of the fortress were disabled. Within 24 hours, the garrison of 1,200 surrendered to 78 men who had arrived with working weapons and the element of surprise. Then Crete, May 1941, the largest airborne operation in history to that point. Over 22,000 German Fallschirmjäger and mountain troops dropped or glided onto the island in a bold attempt to seize it entirely from the air. The operation was catastrophically costly. At Malm Airfield, New Zealand defenders shot German paratroopers in their harnesses killed them as they struggled to reach weapons stored in separate drop containers, mowed them down in the open fields where they landed. The German losses were so severe that Adolf Hitler would never again authorize a major airborne offensive for the rest of the war. But Crete fell. Despite the slaughter, despite the thousands of dead Fallschirmjäger hanging from trees and sprawled across airfield runways, the island fell. And the lesson that American military planners extracted from the blood-soaked fields of Maleme was as stark and as unambiguous as a bullet. The German paratroopers who survived the initial drop and could fight immediately were the ones who turned the tide. Speed from parachute to gunshot was the single most critical variable in airborne warfare. Every second between a man's boots hitting the ground and his weapon being ready to fire was a second the enemy could use to kill him. The Germans understood this truth. They had paid for it with the lives of thousands of Fallschirmjäger on Crete. The Americans were still sending their paratroopers into the sky with disassembled rifles and canvas bags. The Ordnance Department issued an urgent request: develop a compact, lightweight weapon with greater range and accuracy than a pistol. It needed to weigh roughly half as much as the Thompson submachine gun or the M1 Garand. It needed to be something paratroopers could carry without compromising the mobility that made airborne operations possible. The answer arrived in 1941. The M1 carbine, 5.2 pounds unloaded, 35.6 inches long, chambered in 30. Carbine round. Winchester developed specifically for this weapon, firing a 110-grain bullet at 1,990 feet per second with 967 foot-pounds of energy at the muzzle. More than twice as powerful as the Thompson's .45 ACP at close range, and far more accurate at any distance beyond 50 yards. Effective to 300 yards. More than adequate for the close-range fighting paratroopers expected behind enemy lines. The 15-round detachable box magazine was a tactical revelation compared to the Garand's 8-round en-bloc clip. The Garand could not be partially reloaded. Once a clip was inserted, the shooter fired all 8 rounds or nothing. The metallic ping of the empty clip ejecting told everyone within earshot that the weapon was empty. The carbine's box magazine swapped in under 2 seconds, partially loaded or fully loaded, at any point in a firefight. A Paratrooper with 3 loaded magazines had 45 rounds immediately available. A Garand shooter with 3 clips had 24. Production ramped across a network of American manufacturers so extraordinary it still has no parallel in the history of industrial mobilization. Over 6 million M1 carbines would be produced during the war, making it the most manufactured American military small arm of the entire conflict. The list of manufacturers reads like a directory of American civilian industry forced into uniform Winchester. Inland Division of General Motors, IBM. Underwood Typewriter. Rock-Ola, the company that made jukeboxes. National Postal Meter. Quality Hardware. Standard Products. Saginaw Steering Gear, another General Motors division. A typewriter company, a jukebox manufacturer, a postal equipment maker, 2 steering gear factories, all building the same weapon to the same specifications with interchangeable parts. This was the arsenal of democracy in action, and it was unlike anything the world had ever seen. But even at 35.6 inches, the standard M1 carbine was too long for safe parachute operations. In early 1942, Army Ordnance issued a new request: design a carbine with a folding or collapsible stock. Reduce the overall length enough that the weapon can ride flat against a paratrooper's body during the jump. Maintain full functionality when deployed. The stakes were enormous. The 82nd Airborne Division was already scheduling overseas deployment. Intelligence reports indicated major airborne operations for North Africa and Sicily. Every week without a solution was another week. American paratroopers would jump into combat carrying improvised, inadequate weapons. Every training jump at Fort Benning reinforced what Sullivan had been writing in his weekly reports: the current system does not work, and men will die because of it. 3 companies submitted designs. 2 were rejected as unacceptable. The 3rd submission came from a place so unlikely that the men who reviewed it must have checked the letterhead twice. Inland Manufacturing Division of General Motors, Dayton, Ohio. A company that had been organized in 1922 for the purpose of manufacturing wood-wrapped steering wheels for automobiles. They operated out of the former Dayton Wright Airplane Company factory, the very hangars where Orville and Wilbur Wright's aviation company had once assembled aircraft. The hangar-shaped silhouette had become Inland's corporate logo. 20 years after its founding, the company had evolved from wooden steering wheels to rubber processing to a vast array of automotive components, and by 1942, it was ramping up to become the largest producer of M1 carbines in the country. By the war's end, Inland would manufacture 2,632,097 carbines, roughly 43% of every M1 carbine produced during the entire war. They were automotive engineers. They were mass production specialists. They were experts in designing mechanisms that had to work for ordinary people under ordinary stress on ordinary days. They were not gunsmiths. They had never designed a firearm component from scratch, and they were about to solve a problem that the gun industry could not. The man who led the effort was an engineer named Walter Brandt. He was 42 years old in 1942, German-American, born and raised in Dayton. His father, Heinrich Brandt, had emigrated from a small town near Stuttgart in the Kingdom of Württemberg in 1895, arriving in America with a machinist's toolkit and a conviction that would shape his son's entire career. The Swabian principle. A craftsman's highest achievement is not making something beautiful or impressive. It is making something that works perfectly for its intended purpose. Every single time. Measure twice. Cut once. And never ever make something complicated when something simple will do the same job. Walter joined Inland straight out of high school in 1918 and spent the next 24 years learning what it meant to design mechanisms for the real world. Not the world of laboratory testing where conditions are controlled and operators are trained and everything works according to specification. The real world, where it rains and freezes and the user is in a hurry and has never read the manual and is using the product in conditions the designer never imagined. Steering column assemblies that had to survive 10 years of daily use by drivers who never once thought about the mechanism they were turning. Door hinge mechanisms that had to work in Michigan winters when the temperature dropped below zero and ice formed on every metal surface, and the owner grabbed the handle with a gloved hand and yanked. Hood latches that a woman in a fur coat had to be able to operate without instructions. Brake shoe assemblies where failure did not mean an inconvenient trip to the repair shop. Failure meant death. This was the key to everything that followed. Brandt did not design for the skilled operator who followed every procedure correctly in a controlled environment. He designed for the distracted operator, the exhausted operator, the operator who was in a hurry, the operator who was frightened, the operator who was doing the wrong thing at the wrong time in the wrong way. And the product had to work anyway. He designed for the 10,000th unit under the worst conditions, not the first prototype in a laboratory. When Inland's management circulated a memo asking for engineers to volunteer for the folding stock project, Brandt recognized the problem instantly. Not as a firearms challenge, as a packaging and human factors problem. The Paratroopers did not need a new gun. The M1 carbine was proven. It worked. What they needed was a new way to carry it through the most violent, disorienting, terrifying 30 seconds of a human life, a combat parachute jump from 600 feet over enemy territory in the dark. Packaging for extreme conditions was something automotive engineers understood in their bones. Brandt studied the jump sequence the way he would study any mechanical engineering problem. He broke it into phases with specific force profiles. Exit velocity 120 miles per hour. Opening shock approximately 4 Gs of sudden deceleration when the parachute deployed. Landing impact 20 feet per second, the equivalent of jumping off a 12-foot wall while wearing 88 pounds of equipment. He watched training films of soldiers fumbling with equipment under simulated stress, and he saw what he always saw when he watched a customer try to use a product for the first time. Confusion. Hesitation. Wrong sequence. Wrong motion. Wasted seconds. His conclusion was devastating in its simplicity and revolutionary in its implications. Every existing folding stock design in military service worldwide assumed that the operator had two things: time and fine motor control. Paratroopers had neither. The solution could not require buttons to press, latches to locate, levers to manipulate. Any mechanism that demanded conscious thought or precise finger movement would fail when a man's hands were shaking from adrenaline, numbed from cold, slippery with blood, or simply moving too fast for the brain to guide with precision. Under extreme combat stress, the human body reverts to gross motor skills, the large, powerful, imprecise movements that the oldest parts of the brain can execute without conscious direction. Brandt designed for gross motor skills. The Inland proposal was elegantly, almost defiantly simple: a side-folding stock that replaced the standard full-length wooden stock of the M1 carbine. Any standard M1 carbine action could be dropped directly into it without modification. A walnut pistol grip provided the firing grip surface. A spring-loaded wire buttstock folded to the left side of the weapon. When folded, the overall length was 25 inches. When deployed, 35.6 inches, identical to the standard carbine. Weight remained at 5.2 pounds. And here was the critical innovation. The detail that separated this design from every other folding stock in the world. There was no locking mechanism. The stock was not positively locked in either the open or the closed position. It was held in place by a spring-loaded cam. Push the stock and the cam engaged. Push again and the cam released. No buttons, no latches, no levers, no fine motor skills required. One gross motor movement, push until it clicks. A man who had opened a car door could deploy this stock. The motion was neurologically identical. At Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, Major Douglas Harmon reviewed the inland submission and identified what he believed was a critical deficiency. Harmon was a career Army Ordnance officer, West Point class of 1930, methodical and thorough. He was not a bureaucrat or an obstacle. He was a professional engineer whose job was to ensure that every weapon the Army fielded met rigorous standards of reliability and safety. His concern was legitimate. Every military folding stock design in current worldwide service used a positive locking mechanism in both the open and closed positions. The lock ensured that the stock could not inadvertently fold during firing, which would make the weapon extremely difficult to control or deploy during a parachute descent, which could snag on equipment or risers. Inland's design relied entirely on a spring-loaded cam that could theoretically be defeated by sufficient force. The confrontation between Brandt's automotive philosophy and Harmon's traditional ordnance thinking was a genuine professional disagreement between two competent men who both cared about the soldiers who would carry this weapon. Harmon's position was grounded in decades of established engineering practice. Brandt's position was grounded in 24 years of designing mechanisms for the real world. Brandt's argument came from a place Harmon had never inhabited: the factory floor, the customer complaint file, the warranty claim data. A lock was a mechanism. Mechanisms had parts. Parts could jam, freeze, corrode, clog with sand or mud, break under shock. Refuse to operate when the user's hands were cold, wet, gloved, bloody, or trembling. A lock required a conscious decision at a moment when conscious decision-making was degraded beyond reliability. Find the lock. Press it. Verify engagement. Under combat stress with German soldiers closing through a Norman hedgerow, those additional steps were not a minor inconvenience. They were the difference between a weapon that worked in a man's hands and a weapon that killed him by not working. The spring-loaded cam required one motion: push until it clicks. The same motion as opening a car door. The same motion every American performed 10,000 times in a lifetime without ever thinking about it. The debate was not resolved by argument. It was resolved by the calendar. The 82nd Airborne Division was deploying overseas. Sicily was months away. The paratroopers needed a weapon now, and the only design on the table was Inland's. On April 29, 1942, Inland's revised drawings were recommended for standardization as the Model M1A1. On May 12, 1942, the design was officially approved. On August 5, 1942, Inland filed a patent application for the folding stock design. Patent number 24-05758. It would not be granted until August 13, 1946, nearly a year after the war ended. By then, the patent would mean nothing. The design would have already been tested in the only laboratory that matters. Walter Brandt stayed late at the Inland factory the night the approval came through. The building was the former Dayton Wright Company hangars, where the Wright Brothers Aviation Company had once built airplanes, and sometimes late at night, when the production floor was quiet between shifts, Brandt could feel the echo of that earlier generation of engineers who had solved impossible problems in this same space. He held the prototype M1A1 folding stock in his hands and opened it. The cam clicked. He closed it. The cam clicked. He opened it again, closed it again. The mechanism was smooth and fast and decisive. No hesitation, no play, no ambiguity. Open, click, closed. Click. He had been working 16-hour days since the project began. His hands, which used to be steady enough to read a micrometer to 1/1000th of an inch, had developed a tremor from exhaustion and too much coffee. He had lost 15 pounds. His wife Ruth had stopped asking when he would be home for dinner. None of this mattered. What mattered was the thought that followed him from the factory floor to his kitchen table, and from his kitchen table back to the factory floor. The thought that woke him at 3 in the morning and would not let him sleep somewhere in the next 12 months. Young men whose names he would never know were going to step out of airplanes over enemy territory, and the first thing they would reach for was the mechanism he had designed. If the cam failed, if the spring lost tension, if the wire stock bent at the hinge point, if any of the 1,000 things that could go wrong with the mechanism under stress actually went wrong, a man would die. Not a test report, not a warranty claim. A man, someone's son, someone's friend. Someone like Tommy Novak, whose name Brandt would never know, who was at that moment training at Fort Benning with an M1 Garand in a Griswold bag, 11 months away from a wheat field in Sicily, where the wrong weapon would cost him everything. Brandt opened the stock one more time. The cam clicked. Solid. Certain. The sound of Swabian engineering applied to a problem that Swabian engineers were never supposed to solve. He set the prototype down, walked out into the Dayton night, and began the 5-month race to put 140,000 weapons into the hands of the men who needed them most. The clock was running, and it would not stop until the wheat fields of Sicily and the hedgerows of Normandy delivered their verdict on whether a car door latch could save a paratrooper's life. The inland manufacturing facility in Dayton ran around the clock in the summer of 1942, 3 shifts of workers cycling through a building so large that a man standing at one end could not see the other. The air tasted of machine oil and hot metal and the faint sweetness of walnut sawdust drifting from the stock finishing area where women in cotton aprons sanded pistol grips with the care that belonged to cabinet makers, not munitions workers. Because that is exactly what they were. Cabinet makers and woodworkers and rubber processors and steering column assemblers. All of them civilians 6 months ago. All of them building weapons. Now. All of them aware in some vague but persistent way that the objects passing through their hands would end up in the hands of young men who would use them to stay alive. The M1A1 assembly process was like everything about Inland's approach, brutally simple. Complete M1 carbine actions were pulled directly from the standard production line. The same receiver stamped Inland Division on the left side. The same barrel with its 4-groove rifling and 1 20-inch right-hand twist. The same bolt. The same trigger group. The same gas piston. The same operating slide. Every component that made the weapon fire was identical to the parts going into the hundreds of thousands of standard M1 carbines rolling off the line at a rate that would eventually reach 90,000 per month. The only difference was the stock. Instead of sliding the action into a full-length walnut stock, the assemblers placed it into the M1A1 folding stock with its walnut pistol grip, spring-loaded wire buttstock, and the cam mechanism that Walter Brandt had designed in this same building 3 months earlier. Serial numbers were whatever Inland serial numbers reached the folding stock assembly point at the time the action was mated to the stock. There was no separate serial number sequence, no special tracking system, no paperwork distinguishing the M1A1 as a different weapon. Because it was not a different weapon, it was the same proven M1 carbine in a different package. This decision had consequences that rippled through the entire military logistics system in ways that saved time, money, and lives. Every armorer in the Army who had been trained to service the M1 carbine could service the M1A1 without a single hour of additional instruction. Every spare part except the folding stock itself was interchangeable between the 2 models. The ammunition was identical. The magazines were identical. If a folding stock was damaged beyond field repair, the armorer pulled the action out and dropped it into a standard wooden stock, and the weapon continued to function as a regular M1 carbine. No special supply chain. No specialized repair depots. No additional training manuals. This was automotive thinking translated to military logistics. 1 part number, 1 supply chain, 1 training program, minimum complexity, maximum flexibility. The same philosophy that made General Motors the largest corporation in the world applied to a weapon that weighed 5 pounds and measured 25 inches folded. The subcontractor network that produced the M1A1 stock components was itself a miniature portrait of American wartime manufacturing. S.E. Overton Company of South Haven, Michigan supplied the wooden components. Pistol grips machined from American walnut using techniques that Overton's craftsmen had developed making fine furniture. Every grip was shaped to fit the human hand, naturally sanded smooth, and finished to military specification with the same attention to detail that a furniture maker would give to a dining room chair. Because that is what Overton's people knew how to do, and they did it with a precision that no weapons manufacturer could match. Royal Typewriter Incorporated of Hartford, Connecticut, was contracted to produce the wire buttstock and assemble the complete folding stock units. They manufactured the spring-loaded hardware, received the wooden components from Overton, assembled the finished stocks, and shipped them to Inland's Dayton facility. The rivets holding the assembly together were automotive brake shoe rivets components that Inland's engineers selected because their failure rates and stress tolerances were documented across decades of use in millions of General Motors automobiles. No guesswork, no theoretical calculations, known performance under known loads. The leather cheek rest on the wire buttstock was cut, stitched, and attached using techniques borrowed from car seat upholstery. Every material, every fastener, every component was chosen because it could be mass-produced, field repaired, and abused without catastrophic failure. Then Royal Typewriter hit a wall. The details were never publicly documented in the way that a modern corporate failure would be analyzed and reported. What the records show is that stocks assembled at Royal Typewriter's Hartford facility did not consistently meet Army ordnance tolerances. Hardware components varied beyond acceptable limits. The precision that produced excellent typewriter mechanisms, a precision measured in the smooth travel of keys, and the clean strike of hammers on ribbon, did not automatically translate to the different demands of military weapon components. A typewriter key that is slightly loose still types a letter. A folding stock hinge that is slightly loose means a weapon that wobbles under recoil, and a weapon that wobbles under recoil means a man who misses the shot that would have saved his life. Production delays in mid-1942 threatened the entire M1A1 program. The 82nd Airborne Division was already overseas. The invasion of Sicily was being planned. The paratroopers needed folding stock carbines, and the company contracted to assemble the stocks could not deliver them to specification. The solution demonstrated the kind of institutional flexibility that was one of America's greatest wartime advantages, and that no peacetime bureaucracy could replicate. S.E. Overton, the furniture company in South Haven that had been supplying the walnut components, assumed full assembly responsibility. By May 1944, Overton had effectively canceled Royal Typewriter's contract, purchased all of Royal's equipment and inventory related to the M1A1, and relocated it to their Michigan facility. The J.S. Richardson Company of Sheboygan Falls, Wisconsin, was brought in to manufacture the pistol grips for the second production run, easing Overton's workload. Overton's craftsmen spent time and money bringing Royal Typewriter's existing inventory up to ordnance standards before integrating it into their own production flow. No committee deliberated for 6 months. No procurement contract was renegotiated through layers of Pentagon bureaucracy. Equipment was shipped. Responsibility was transferred. Production continued. A typewriter company could not build it. A furniture company could. This was America in 1942. Problems were solved by whoever could solve them fastest, and what your business card said you did for a living mattered less than whether you could do the job that needed doing right now. First deliveries began in October 1942. On schedule, 71,000 M1A1 carbines shipped between October 1942 and October 1943. The weapons arrived at the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions with specialized accessories designed for airborne operations, including the jump scabbard, a padded canvas holster that attached to the paratrooper's pistol belt at the top with a leg strap at the bottom that could theoretically be secured around the ankle. The leg strap nearly ruined everything the weapon was designed to accomplish. Reports from field training and early tactical exercises revealed a problem that should have been obvious to anyone who had ever made a parachute landing, but was apparently invisible to the engineers who designed the scabbard from behind a desk. A man's full body weight plus equipment hitting the ground at 20 feet per second. A 5-pound weapon strapped to the ankle by a leather strap. The physics were straightforward and merciless. The weapon acted as a concentrated mass at the end of a lever arm, and when the paratrooper's foot struck the ground, the strap transferred the weapon's momentum directly through the ankle joint. Broken legs, severe sprains, torn ligaments. The jump scabbard with its leg strap was an engineering solution designed by men who had never jumped out of an airplane, and the men who had jumped out of airplanes recognized this instantly. Paratroopers did what paratroopers have always done when issued equipment that does not work. They improvised. Many tucked the folded M1A1 behind their reserve parachute, securing it with existing harness straps so it rode flat against the chest. Others carried it diagonally across the back or strapped across the torso. The Army did not officially authorize these modifications. The Army did not stop them either. Combat has a ruthless efficiency in separating what works from what does not. And the men whose lives depended on the distinction were better judges than any testing board. It was during this period that Frank Kowalski first held an M1A1 carbine. He was 21 years old, assigned to the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division. Training for a deployment everyone knew was coming, but no one was permitted to discuss. His best friend Tommy Novak stood beside him at the company armory when the new weapons were distributed. Tommy received an M1 Garand, the same weapon most of the regiment carried. Frank received the M1A1. He picked it up, felt the weight settle into his hands. 5.2 pounds, compact, balanced. He folded the stock against the left side of the receiver, 25 inches. He could tuck it behind his reserve chute and barely know it was there. Then he pushed the stock out to the firing position. The spring-loaded cam engaged with a click that Frank recognized the way he recognized the sound of his mother's voice or the whistle at the shift change at Southworks. It was a car door latch. He had opened and closed car doors 10,000 times in his life. His hands knew this motion. His muscles knew this motion. There was nothing to learn, nothing to practice, nothing to think about. Push until it clicks. Tommy watched him and grinned. You and your little toy gun Kowalski. When are you going to carry a real weapon? Frank did not have an answer. He would not have one for 11 months. Before the regiment shipped out, Sullivan put the M1A1 through a testing protocol that went beyond anything the Ordnance Department's proving ground required. He threw it in mud and pulled it out and fired it. He dropped it from a height calculated to simulate a parachute landing impact. He submerged it in a bucket of water for 5 minutes, pulled it out, shook it once and fired it. He dragged it through sand on a rope behind a jeep for 200 yards, wiped the action with a rag and fired it. He loaded a magazine with deliberately corroded ammunition to see if the feed mechanism would jam. It did not. Each time the spring-loaded cam held. Each time the folding stock deployed cleanly. Each time the weapon fired. Sullivan's verdict was delivered in the weapons room at Fort Benning, with the economy of a man who had spent 14 years eliminating unnecessary words from his vocabulary, the way he eliminated unnecessary movements from his weapons handling. The cam holds. I have nothing else to say about it. But late that night, after the regiment's equipment had been crated for overseas shipment, Sullivan went back to the weapons room alone. The building was empty. The overhead lights cast long shadows across the rows of cleaned and oiled weapons waiting for the war. He picked up an M1A1, opened the stock. Click, closed it. Click, opened it. Click. He had told his men the cam holds. He had staked his professional reputation on it. A 14-year NCO's reputation was the only currency he had earned over thousands of inspections and hundreds of training exercises, and a career spent in places where equipment failure was not an abstract concept, but a specific memory of a specific man who died because something broke at the wrong moment. The cam held in mud, in water, in sand, after drops and drags and deliberate abuse. He knew it held, but he had never carried it out of an airplane at 600 feet over enemy territory in the dark. He had never felt the opening shock that could rip a weapon from a man's harness and send it spinning into the void. He had never landed with all that weight in a field where the sounds in the darkness might be friendly or might be the last sounds he would ever hear. Knowing something in a weapons room at Fort Benning and knowing it in a combat zone were different species of knowledge. Sullivan had been a soldier long enough to understand the difference. He opened the stock one more time. Click. Solid. Certain. The sound of a mechanism doing exactly what it was designed to do. He set the weapon down, walked out into the Georgia night. The doubt would not resolve until Sicily provided the answer. Sicily provided the answer in blood. The night of July 9th to 10th, 1943. 226 C-47 transports carried approximately 3,400 paratroopers of the 505th Parachute Regimental Combat Team from airfields at Kairouan, Tunisia, toward the southern coast of Sicily. High winds reaching 35 miles per hour, more than twice the safety limit for training, jumps battered the formations. Young pilots flying at night over unfamiliar terrain in their first combat mission lost their bearings within minutes of crossing the coastline. Navigation disintegrated. Only 40% of the paratroopers landed anywhere near their assigned drop zones. Frank Kowalski exited his C-47 into wind and darkness and anti-aircraft fire and descended into an olive grove somewhere on the island of Sicily, with no idea where he was. No idea where his unit was, and no idea whether the sounds in the darkness were American or German or Italian. He landed hard among the olive trees. Branches scratched his face and hands. He lay still for 3 seconds listening. Distant gunfire, the drone of aircraft engines overhead. Nothing close. He released his parachute harness, reached behind his reserve chute. The M1A1 was there exactly where he had tucked it flat against his chest, held by the webbing straps. He pulled it free, snapped the stock open with one hand in the dark. Click. The cam engaged. The same sound from the weapons room at Fort Benning. The same sound from the company armory where Tommy had grinned and called it a toy gun. Solid. Certain. A mechanism doing exactly what it was designed to do. He chambered around, armed and moving within seconds of his boots touching Sicilian soil. 300 yards to the southeast in an open wheat field outside the village of Gela. Tommy Novak was not armed. Tommy's Griswold bag had separated from his harness during the opening shock. The canvas sack with its disassembled M1 Garand had fallen into the Sicilian darkness and vanished into waist-high wheat under a quarter moon. Tommy had his .45 pistol, 2 magazines, 14 rounds. He crawled through the wheat, searching for the bag, running his hands through the stalks, feeling for canvas that was the same color as the soil and the same temperature as the night. He searched for 1 minute, 2 minutes, an eternity measured in heartbeats and the growing certainty that he was not alone in this field. A German patrol from the Hermann Goering Panzer Division found him before he found the bag. Frank heard the shots from the olive grove. Short, controlled, spaced, not the rapid exchange of a firefight between men who could defend themselves. The measured, deliberate shots of soldiers who had found a man with a pistol in a wheat field and knew exactly what to do about it. Frank ran toward the shots. He ran with the weapon that worked. He ran through olive trees and across a stone wall and into the edge of the wheat field, his M1A1 at his shoulder, scanning for movement, his heart hammering against the carbine's folding stock. He was too late. The narration does not describe what Frank found. The audience understands. The silence after the shots told him everything, and the silence is more terrible than any description. What the narration does say is this: Tommy Novak died because he carried the wrong weapon. The weapon he should have carried existed. It was in the hands of the man 300 yards away. The difference between Tommy dying and Tommy living was not courage. Tommy had more courage than most men will ever need. The difference was not training. Tommy had been trained by the same instructors at the same school. The difference was which package the weapon came in. A Griswold bag that separated during the opening shock, or an M1A1 with a folding stock tucked behind a reserve parachute. 3 seconds versus 40 seconds. Tommy Novak ran out of time in a Sicilian wheat field, and the weapon that killed him was the one that did not work when he needed it. Across the Sicilian countryside, the broader pattern of the operation was becoming clear. Colonel James M. Gavin, the 36-year-old commander of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, landed far from his drop zone and was initially unsure whether he was even on the island. He gathered scattered paratroopers as he moved cross-country, building a fighting force from the fragments of a dozen units. He led them to Biazza Ridge, a piece of high ground overlooking the roads the Germans would use to reinforce the coast. And there his paratroopers faced elements of the Hermann Goering Panzer Division with Tiger tanks. A few hundred lightly armed men against armored vehicles they had no business fighting. They held. They held because they were armed and aggressive and refused to yield ground even when the tanks were close enough to hear the grinding of their treads. The scattered drops that were supposed to be a disaster became an accidental weapon. Small groups of armed paratroopers appeared in random locations across the German and Italian rear areas, cutting telephone lines, ambushing supply convoys, seizing crossroads, creating a confusion so widespread that German commanders could not determine the size or objective of the airborne force. The confusion paralyzed the German response and bought critical hours for the seaborne landings to establish a beachhead. But this advantage existed only because the scattered paratroopers were armed. Men without weapons behind enemy lines were not tactical disruption. They were casualties. The M1A1 carbine was the difference between an armed guerrilla force and a collection of lost, helpless men waiting to be captured or killed. Then came the second night. July 11, 1943. C-47 transports carrying reinforcements from the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment flew the designated safe corridor over the Allied invasion fleet. Minutes earlier, German bombers had attacked the same fleet. Ships were burning on the water. Every anti-aircraft gunner on every vessel and every shore battery was exhausted, terrified, and primed to fire at anything that flew overhead. The C-47s appeared in the darkness. Low, slow, their silhouettes identical to enemy bombers in the smoke and confusion. One nervous gunner opened fire. Within seconds, every gun in the fleet joined in. The sky became a wall of tracers. 23 C-47 transport aircraft were shot down. 37 more were heavily damaged. 318 American paratroopers were killed or wounded by their own side. Among the dead was Brigadier General Charles L. Kierans, Jr., the 82nd Airborne Division's assistant commander, aboard a plane that was lost at sea. The catastrophe nearly ended the American airborne program. General Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, seriously considered canceling all future large-scale airborne operations. The concept that thousands of men had trained for that the M1A1 had been designed for that Sullivan and Brandt and Kowalski had invested their professional lives and personal faith in hung by a thread over the burning water off the coast of Sicily. Major General Matthew Ridgway saved it. He argued with the force of a man who had watched his paratroopers fight and die and win against impossible odds that the problems were problems of coordination and execution, not fundamental flaws in the concept. Fix the navigation with Pathfinder teams. Fix the friendly fire with better communication. Fix the scattered drops with better pilot training. What you cannot deny, Ridgway insisted, is that the men who landed with weapons and fought proved that airborne warfare works. The airborne program survived. Barely. For Sullivan, Sicily resolved the doubt that had kept him standing alone in a weapons room at Fort Benning. The cam held. Not in a test. Not in an exercise. Under the actual conditions of combat with actual opening shock and actual enemy fire and actual men's lives, depending on a spring-loaded mechanism designed by automotive engineers in Ohio. The cam held. Sullivan's doubt did not transform into confidence through a dramatic moment of revelation. It dissolved slowly as the after-action reports accumulated, each one confirming what the proving ground tests had suggested and what Sullivan's professional instinct had believed but could not confirm until the evidence came in from the field. For Brandt in Dayton, the reports from Sicily arrived through Army channels with the dry language of military documentation. Between the lines, the message was clear. The M1A1 performed. The cam held through opening shock. The wire buttstock did not collapse under recoil. The weapon functioned in dust and debris, and the chaos of a scattered airborne assault exactly as his team had designed it to function. He read the reports in his office in the former Wright brothers' hangars and permitted himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Then, he thought about the invasion of France that everyone knew was coming, and the satisfaction faded into the same weight that had been pressing on him since the day the M1A1 was approved. More paratroopers, more jumps. More men reaching behind their reserve chutes in the dark and depending on a cam mechanism to engage. The weapon worked in Sicily. It needed to work in Normandy. And Normandy would be worse than Sicily in every way that mattered. 11 months between Sicily and D-Day, the 82nd Airborne Division moved to England. The 101st Airborne Division, which had not yet seen combat, trained alongside them. Pathfinder teams were organized and equipped with Rebecca Eureka radar transponders to mark drop zones. Anti-aircraft identification procedures were overhauled. Every lesson from Sicily's disasters was incorporated into training. The M1A1 carbine required no modifications. No improvements were requested by the troops who carried it. No design changes were ordered by ordnance. In a military system that constantly evaluated, criticized, and modified every piece of equipment based on field feedback, the complete absence of any change request was the most powerful endorsement possible. The folding stock that Brandt had designed in the Dayton factory remained unchanged from the first production unit to the last. The spring-loaded cam, the wire buttstock, the walnut pistol grip, the automotive brake shoe rivets, all of it exactly as it had been the day it left the assembly line. The second production run began in April 1944, producing approximately 69,000 additional M1A1 carbines through December 1944. S.E. Overton handled all stock assembly, now their furniture craftsmen stamping each stock with the OI marking Overton Inland on the barrel channel, a marking that collectors would seek out decades later as proof of authenticity. Sullivan, now serving with an airborne unit in England, trained replacement paratroopers with the intensity of a man who had seen what happened when weapons failed, and men died, and the survivors had to write letters home, explaining how it happened without actually explaining how it happened. He had men deploy the M1A1 blindfolded. In rain, in mud, with gloves on, with one hand. His standard was 3 seconds. Stowed to loaded in 3 seconds, or you train again. He taught them something no manual covered. How to listen for the cam. The click of the spring-loaded cam engaging was a specific sound. Solid, metallic, decisive. It did not sound like any other piece of equipment in a paratrooper's kit. In the noise and chaos of a combat landing, that click was the most important sound a man could hear. Listen for the click, Sullivan told his men standing in English rain on a training field that smelled of wet grass and aviation fuel from the nearby airstrip. When you hear that click, you know you have a weapon. Everything after that is just soldiering, and you know how to soldier. That is why you are here. Kowalski promoted to corporal after Sicily trained alongside the replacements, but did not speak much. He had the quiet authority of a combat veteran, the kind of silence that young soldiers recognized instinctively as the silence of a man who had seen the thing they were about to see and had come back from it, changed in ways he could not describe and would not try to describe because the words did not exist. He cleaned his M1A1 every evening. Field stripped it on a canvas tarp in his billet in the English countryside. He knew every component by touch. The bolt that rotated to lock, the gas piston, the recoil spring, the magazine release, and the folding stock with its spring-loaded cam that opened and closed with the same precision it had on the first day. He held it the day Tommy stood beside him and grinned and called it a toy gun. Tommy's M1A1 would have looked exactly like this one, would have weighed the same, would have folded to the same 25 inches, would have deployed with the same click, would have been ready in the same 3 seconds. Tommy never got one. Tommy got a Garand in a Griswold bag, and Tommy was buried in a temporary cemetery in Sicily while Frank cleaned a weapon in England and tried not to hear the sound of controlled shots in a wheat field at 2 a.m, the evening of June 5th, 1944. Airfields across southern England. Thousands of paratroopers boarded C-47 transports in the fading light, each man carrying nearly 40 kilograms of equipment, and the knowledge that within hours they would be stepping into the darkness over France to begin the liberation of a continent. Frank Kowalski checked his M1A1 one final time, folded the stock, tucked it behind his reserve parachute, felt the familiar weight settle against his chest, the weapon that Tommy should have had. The weapon that would have saved Tommy's life if the Army had figured out sooner what a steering wheel factory in Dayton, Ohio already knew. That the best weapon is the one that works the second you need it. He boarded the aircraft. The engines coughed, caught, roared. The C-47 taxied to the runway and turned into the wind. On another airfield, Sullivan climbed into a different C-47. Before he disappeared through the cargo door, he turned to the young replacements filing aboard behind him, boys who had never heard a shot fired in anger. Boys who were about to jump into the largest airborne operation in human history. The weapon that kills you, Sullivan said, is the one that doesn't work when you need it. Then he climbed aboard. The door closed. The engines rose to full power. The aircraft rolled down the runway and lifted into the English twilight, heading south toward the Channel, toward France, toward the most important night of the 20th century. Sicily had been the rehearsal. Every mistake, every scattered drop, every man killed by friendly fire, every man killed because he carried the wrong weapon in the wrong package. All of it was a lesson written in blood on the fields and hillsides of an island that most of these young paratroopers could not find on a map. Normandy would be the final exam, and the exam was 12 hours away. June 6th, 1944. Shortly after midnight, 13,100 American paratroopers are airborne over the English Channel, flying south in formations of C-47 transports that stretch across the night sky like a river of aluminum and engine noise. The 101st Airborne Division will drop 6,928 men in Operation Albany, tasked with seizing the causeways leading off Utah Beach. The 82nd Airborne's Operation Boston carries 6,420 paratroopers in 369 aircraft tasked with capturing the town of Sainte-Mère-Église and the bridges over the Meurthe River. The Pathfinders jump first at 12:15 in the morning. Their job is to mark the drop zones using Rebecca Eureka radar beacons and halophane signal lights so the main force can land on target. Only one of the 5 American drop zones is accurately marked. The others are compromised by enemy fire equipment failure or the simple and terrible fact that a man descending in darkness over terrain he has never seen before cannot always find the field that looks so clear on an aerial photograph taken in daylight 6 weeks earlier. The main force begins jumping at 1:21 in the morning. Within minutes, the operation dissolves. A cloud bank over the Cotentin Peninsula forces pilots to climb or dive. The tight formations trained over English fields for months shatter in seconds. German anti-aircraft fire erupts from positions intelligence never identified. Not the heavy 88mm guns, but the rapid-fire 20 and 37mm weapons that fill the sky with tracers at the exact altitude the transports are flying. Pilots take evasive action. Some dive to treetop level where the flak cannot depress far enough to track them. Others climb above the clouds and lose all visual reference to the ground below. The green jump light, which is supposed to illuminate at a precise navigational point, comes on whenever the pilot decides his passengers need to leave before his aircraft becomes a fireball. The drops are catastrophically scattered. Paratroopers who plan to land in tight regimental groups near specific objectives find themselves alone in Norman pastures, sometimes tens of kilometers from where they should be. The 507th and 508th Parachute Infantry Regiments of the 82nd Airborne are spread across miles of countryside west of the flooded Meurthe River. Only Colonel William Ekman's 505th PIR lands with any meaningful concentration near Sainte-Mère-Église. Equipment tie-downs that held during peaceful English training fail under the violence of evasive maneuvers and premature exits. Griswold bags tear loose and fall into the darkness. Ammunition pouches vanish. Grenades separate from web gear. Men land in areas the Germans have deliberately flooded by damming the Meurthe and Douve rivers, creating shallow lakes that look like meadows from 600 feet at night. Paratroopers crash into knee-deep water that seems survivable until they stumble into drainage ditches over their heads, weighted down by their equipment legs tangled in suspension lines, harness buckles requiring 2 free hands and clear thinking to release. Some men drown in 3 feet of water on the first night of the liberation of France. Then the German patrols begin to move. And this is where the story of the M1A1 carbine reaches its defining moment. The German defenders of the Cotentin Peninsula have a plan for airborne landings. It is a good plan built on experience and sound tactical logic. Identify the drop zones. Concentrate forces. Counterattack before the paratroopers can organize. Destroy them in detail while they are still scattered, confused, and vulnerable. The plan assumes that scattered paratroopers will behave the way scattered paratroopers are supposed to behave. Disoriented, unarmed, fumbling with equipment. Searching for weapons lost during the jump. Easy prey. The plan is wrong. Frank Kowalski's C-47 has been driven miles off course by anti-aircraft fire and the cloud bank. The pilot, the same captain from Columbus who fought the yoke through the flak over the channel banks and dives and climbs in a sequence of maneuvers that throw the standing paratroopers against each other like freight in a boxcar. The green light comes on at a moment that corresponds to no navigational fix anyone in the aircraft can identify. Frank shuffles to the door, steps into the void. The slipstream tears at his equipment. The static line pulls the main chute open, and the opening shock hits him with a force that compresses his spine and drives the breath from his lungs. Then the parachute is fully deployed, and he is floating swaying beneath the silk canopy, descending through a sky cross-hatched with tracers. Red lines and green lines arc beneath his boots. He can see the dark shapes of other parachutes drifting in the wind, some close, some impossibly far away. Below him, the Norman landscape is a patchwork of small dark fields separated by the black lines of hedgerows. Nothing matches any photograph he has ever studied. He lands in a pasture surrounded by bocage, ancient earthen banks 3 feet high topped with dense hedgerows that have been growing since before the Norman conquest. The landing is hard. The weight of his equipment drives him into the soft earth, and he rolls once his helmet catching on a root. His harness straps digging into his shoulders. For 1 second, he lies still, listening. Gunfire in the distance, the drone of aircraft engines, a dog barking somewhere in the Norman darkness. No voices close. Then his hands move. They move the way they have moved 1,000 times in training, and once before in a Sicilian olive grove, without conscious thought, without deliberation, without the kind of fine motor planning that terror destroys. They move the way a man's hands move when they open a car door or turn a steering wheel. Gross motor skills. The deep, reliable movements that the oldest parts of the brain can execute when the newer parts are overwhelmed by fear. Release harness. Roll clear of canopy. Reach behind, reserve, shoot. The M1A1 is there. His hands find it by touch, the way they would find his own face in the dark. He pulls it free, snaps the stock open. The spring-loaded cam engages. Click. The sound cuts through the noise of the Norman night, the way a familiar voice cuts through a crowd. Not loud, not dramatic, just certain. The sound of a mechanism designed by an automotive engineer in Dayton, Ohio, doing exactly what it was designed to do under exactly the conditions it was designed to survive. For one heartbeat, Frank hears another sound beneath the click. Not a real sound, a memory. Tommy Novak's voice on the troop ship crossing the Atlantic, months before Sicily, sitting across from Frank in the hold with the engine vibration rattling their mess kits, Tommy cleaning his M1 Garand, while Frank cleaned his M1A1. Tommy grinning the way Southside kids grin when they are about to say something that is supposed to be funny, and is also supposed to be a little bit mean. You and your little toy gun Kowalski. When are you going to carry a real weapon? Frank chambers a round from the 15-round magazine, the action cycle smooth and clean. He is armed. He is moving. 3 seconds after his boots hit French soil. He fights for Tommy. He fights with the weapon Tommy should have had. He uses his cricket clicker. One click, silence. He moves along the hedgerow weapon at his shoulder. Tries again. One click. From the darkness, 2 clicks in response. He finds 3 other paratroopers in the adjacent field. 2 carry M1A1 carbines and are already armed, scanning for threats. The third man is on his knees with a Griswold bag, hands trembling trying to thread a Garand barrel into a receiver in the dark. The threads keep slipping. His fingers are numb from the cold at altitude. There is dirt in the receiver from landing. Frank does not look at the man with the Griswold bag for longer than it takes to confirm he is American. He cannot look at him. Looking at him is looking at Tommy. The 3 men with M1A1s establish a perimeter. They begin moving toward the sound of more clickers. Behind them, the man with the Garand is still assembling his weapon. Across the Cotentin Peninsula, this scene repeats itself thousands of times. Not every man with an M1A1 survives. Not every man with the Garand dies. War has no clean narratives and no guaranteed outcomes. But a pattern emerges that is documented in after-action reports and veteran accounts with a consistency that leaves no room for doubt. Paratroopers who land with weapons ready to fire, establish positions faster, organize sooner, and engage the enemy before the enemy can engage them. In the bocage terrain of Normandy, where engagement distances are under 200 yards and often under 50, where a hedgerow can conceal a machine gun position 10 feet from a man who cannot see it, the difference between 3 seconds and 40 seconds is the difference between shooting first and being shot first. At Brecourt Manor near the village of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. 1st Lieutenant Richard Winters of Easy Company, 2nd Battalion. 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division demonstrates what paratroopers can accomplish when they land armed and led by a man who knows how to fight. Winters has assumed acting command of Easy Company after Captain Thomas Meehan was killed when his C-47 crashed during the drop. At the hamlet of Le Grand Chemin on the morning of June 6th, Winters can hear German artillery firing toward the coast. 4 105mm howitzers at Brecourt Manor are shelling Causeway Exit 2, the road the 4th Infantry Division needs to move inland from Utah Beach. His orders are 5 words. There is fire along that hedgerow there. Take care of it. No briefing, no intelligence, no fire support. Winters conducts a solo reconnaissance at approximately 8:30 in the morning. He discovers the 4-gun battery in prepared positions connected by a trench system defended by approximately 60 German soldiers with machine guns. Previous attempts by other units to neutralize the battery have failed. He assembles 12 men. They carry what they have: M1 Garands, M1 carbines, a Thompson submachine gun that 2nd Lieutenant Lynn Compton has borrowed and never fired, and grenades. Sergeant Carwood Lipton climbs a tree to provide observation. Winters positions machine guns for base of fire. He sends Compton Sergeant William Garneri and Private Donald Malarkey to flank. Working down the trench system, 12 Americans destroy 4 German guns defended by 60 men. In one position, Winters finds a map showing every German artillery and machine gun position on the Cotentin Peninsula. Lewis Nixon runs the map 3 miles to Utah Beach. The 4th Infantry Division sends its first 2 tanks to support the paratroopers. 24 men total by the end of the engagement against 60 entrenched defenders. 4 Americans killed, 2 wounded. West Point will study this assault for decades as a textbook example of fire and maneuver. Winters receives the Distinguished Service Cross. The mixed weapons tell the story of airborne combat men fight with whatever they carry. The M1A1 carbine's lighter weight and compact size allow the speed through the dense hedgerows that makes the flanking movements possible. 2,499 American paratroopers become casualties on D-Day. In the 82nd Airborne Division, alone, 156 killed, 347 wounded, 756 missing. 15 of the 16 battalion commanders in the infantry regiments are killed or wounded on a single day. The losses are severe. The scattering is worse than the most pessimistic planning estimate, but the losses would have been catastrophic without the M1A1. This is stated carefully because the men in the audience who know war, and many of them do, will reject any claim that sounds like a commercial. No single weapon wins a battle of this scale. What the M1A1 did was simpler and more important than winning a battle. It gave each man who carried it a fighting chance in the first seconds after landing, the seconds when survival is determined not by strategy or courage or luck, but by whether a man has a functional weapon in his hands. The German perspective confirmed it. Oberstleutnant Friedrich von der Heide, the commander of the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment defending the area around Sainte-Marie-du-Mont and Carentan, was himself an experienced paratrooper. A Bavarian Catholic, a former law professor, a veteran of Crete, who understood airborne warfare from the inside. He knew what scattered paratroopers were supposed to look like because he had been one. What von der Heide encountered on June 6th defied his professional expectations. In the post-war years, he described his surprise at the speed and aggression of the American response. German doctrine assumed that scattered airborne forces would need hours to organize before they could fight effectively. His regiment's defensive plan was built on that assumption. Instead, von der Heide's soldiers encountered small groups of Americans who were shooting and moving and establishing positions within minutes of landing. Not hours, minutes. The German Fallschirmjäger had their own weapons distribution problem. Their doctrine required separate drop containers for crew-served weapons, heavy equipment that landed in canisters near the paratroopers, and had to be located and opened before the soldiers could access anything heavier than a pistol or submachine gun. The Americans had solved this problem with the weapon the soldiers carried on their bodies ready to deploy in 3 seconds. Von der Heide, as a professional airborne soldier, recognized the significance immediately. The Americans had achieved something Germany never had: paratroopers who could fight the instant they touched the ground. When a German paratrooper commander acknowledges that the enemy has solved the armament problem better than his own army, the validation is absolute. Photographic evidence from D-Day revealed something else. The M1 carbine appeared not only on the airborne drop zones, but on the invasion beaches. One photograph from Omaha Beach shows a soldier from the 16th Infantry Regiment, a regular infantry unit with no connection to the airborne operation, sheltering at the base of chalk cliffs, cleaning sand from an M1A1 carbine's action. This weapon was manufactured exclusively for paratroopers, allocated exclusively to airborne units. Yet here it was on the bloodiest beach of the invasion, in the hands of an infantryman who had acquired it through channels no requisition form could describe. Weapons migrate to where they are most useful. Soldiers who can carry any weapon choose the one that works best for the conditions they face. The M1A1 appearing on Omaha Beach was not an accident. It was an endorsement delivered by a man whose life depended on choosing the right tool. The M1A1 carbine was carried in every subsequent American airborne operation of the war. Operation Market Garden in September 1944, where the 82nd Airborne under Brigadier General Gavin fought for the bridges at Nijmegen, and the 101st Airborne held the corridor near Eindhoven, while the British 1st Airborne was destroyed at Arnhem, a bridge too far. The plan failed. The weapon did not. In the urban fighting along the canals and through the buildings of Nijmegen, the M1A1's compact size proved its value in quarters too close for the Garand's 43-inch length. Operation Varsity in March 1945. The largest single-day airborne operation in history. Over 16,000 paratroopers from the U.S. 17th Airborne Division and the British 6th Airborne Division crossing the Rhine into Germany under the 18th Airborne Corps commanded by General Ridgway. American paratroopers carried M1A1 carbines into the last major airborne assault of the European War. The weapon approved in May 1942, performing in March 1945, without a single modification to the folding stock design. 3 years. Unchanged. Working. 140,591 M1A1 carbines produced. Every one built by Inland Manufacturing Division of General Motors. No other manufacturer. The M1 Garand was built by 4 companies. The standard M1 carbine by 10. The M1A 1 by 1. Single-source production that yielded a consistency no multi-contractor program could match. 1 company, 1 design, 1 standard. In the fall of 1944 at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, Major Douglas Harmon sat at his desk reading after-action reports from Normandy. He had been reading such reports for months, each one describing the performance of weapons his department had approved or rejected or modified. He found the airborne sections. He read about scattered drops and immediate engagements at close range. He read about the spring-loaded cam holding through conditions no proving ground protocol could replicate. Harmon remembered his objection from 2 years earlier. The missing lock mechanism. The concern about inadvertent deployment. He had not been wrong to raise the concern. A responsible engineer questions unconventional design decisions. That is what responsible engineers do. But the combat record was unambiguous. No reports of stock failure. No reports of inadvertent deployment during descent. No reports of collapse during firing. In 140,000 weapons across multiple campaigns, the mechanism Walter Brandt designed performed exactly as Brandt predicted it would. Harmon added a note to his file on the M1A1 evaluation. The design has been validated by extensive combat use. The omission of a positive locking mechanism, while contrary to standard practice, has proven operationally sound in the specific conditions of airborne employment. He did not send a letter to Brandt. That is not how the Army works. But within the ordnance community, he became a quiet advocate for a principle he would not have endorsed 2 years earlier, that combat performance overrides theoretical concerns. That the men who use a weapon in the field are the final judges of whether it works, not the men who test it in a laboratory. After the war, M1A1 carbines were supplied to American allies around the world. French paratroopers carried them in Indochina from 1946 through the desperate siege of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. Where French troops aéroportés jumped into a shrinking valley perimeter, carrying the same weapon Inland's automotive engineers had designed for Americans jumping into Sicily and Normandy. The weapon traveled from the Wright brothers' hangars in Dayton, to the olive groves of the Mediterranean, to the hedgerows of France, to the jungles of Southeast Asia. Some saw continued action during the Vietnam War, with American Special Operations Forces and South Vietnamese allies who valued the compact design for close-range jungle combat. Inland's engineers developed variants. The T4 conversion kit added selective fire capability, becoming the M2 carbine. The M3 variant mounted an active infrared night scope, creating one of the first practical night fighting weapons in military history. The folding stock concept that Brandt designed for paratroopers in 1942 was still influencing weapons design decades after the war ended. But none of that is the point. The point is simpler than production numbers or variant designations or post-war legacy. The point is what happened in the darkness of a Norman pasture at 1:14 in the morning on June 6, 1944. When a 22-year-old Polish kid from the south side of Chicago reached behind his reserve parachute and pulled out a weapon designed by a German-American automotive engineer in Dayton, Ohio. Assembled with furniture maker, walnut grips, and automotive brake shoe rivets and car upholstery leather, and snapped the stock open with one hand in the dark. The spring-loaded cam engaged. That click, the same click from 100 training jumps at Fort Benning. From a weapons room where Sullivan opened and closed the stock until his doubt dissolved into certainty. From an olive grove in Sicily where Frank Kowalski armed himself in 3 seconds while his best friend died 300 yards away because he did not have the same weapon. From the prototype in the Dayton factory where Walter Brandt tested the mechanism over and over, night after night, knowing that if it failed, a man would die. From 140,591 weapons that rolled off a single assembly line in a building where the Wright brothers once built airplanes. In Dayton, Ohio, it is 7 hours earlier. Late evening on June 5th, Walter Brandt is home with his wife, Ruth. The radio plays softly. He does not know the invasion has begun. When the morning newspaper arrives, he will sit at his kitchen table with coffee going cold in his hands and read the headlines that change the world. He will think about the cam. He will think about 140,000 weapons. He will think about young men he has never met whose names he will never know, reaching behind their parachute harnesses in the dark over France for the mechanism he designed in a converted airplane hangar. He will not have to wonder whether it works. He already knows. The cam holds. It held in the prototype he tested with trembling hands at midnight. It held on the 10,000th production unit. It held in the mud and sand and water of Sullivan's tests. It held in a Sicilian olive grove at 2 in the morning. It holds now in the fields of Normandy, because it was designed to be simple, and simplicity survives when everything else falls apart. Sullivan's line echoes one final time, not spoken aloud, not narrated as dialogue. Understood. Felt in the muscle memory of every man who landed in Normandy with a weapon that worked the instant he needed it. The weapon that kills you is the one that does not work when you need it. The M1A1 worked, every time, in every condition, from the olive groves of Sicily, to the hedgerows of Normandy, to the canal banks of the Netherlands, to the east bank of the Rhine, and beyond to the jungles of Indochina and the forests of Vietnam, to places Walter Brandt and Eddie Sullivan and the furniture craftsmen of South Haven and the assembly workers of Dayton never imagined their work would reach. The best design is not the one that does everything. The best design is the one that does exactly what is needed when it is needed every time. Nothing more. Nothing less. 140,591 times the cam held. And thousands of American paratroopers came home from the most important battles of the Second World War because a team of engineers in Dayton, Ohio, who spent 20 years making steering wheels and door hinges for General Motors automobiles, understood that simple truth better than anyone else in the world. Frank Kowalski came home. He went back to the South Side. He worked at the steel mill like his father. He never talked about the war much because men who have seen the thing do not talk about the thing. And the men who were there understand without talking, and the men who were not there cannot understand no matter how much you talk. But once years later, his grandson found the M1A1 carbine in the back of a closet, wrapped in an oiled cloth, and asked him what it was. Frank picked it up, felt the weight. 5.2 pounds. He folded the stock against the receiver. 25 inches. He pushed it open with one hand. Click. The cam held. It always held.